Okay, everyone, welcome back. Day 2 of our retreat. We are going to kick off with our benchmark survey with a presentation by Jim Scheulen. For Jim's introduction, I would like to today turn that over to Greg Archwell, who is our co-chair of the benchmark committee. So Greg, why don't you take that introduction?
All right, thanks for allowing me to introduce Jim. So for most of us, Jim needs no introduction. But for those of you that are new, Jim Scheulen is the Chief Administrative Officer for Emergency Medicine and Capacity Management for Johns Hopkins Medicine. He's responsible for the operations of the Johns Hopkins Health System emergency departments, including both the hospital operations and physician practices. Mr. Scheulen is the founder of the Johns Hopkins Access Line and Johns Hopkins Lifeline Critical Care and Transportation Service. And in his new role as Chief Administrative Officer, he leads efforts to manage hospital capacity at Johns Hopkins. In this role, Jim leads institutional efforts and inpatient operations improvement and has led the development of a one-of-a-kind hospital capacity optimization command center. Jim is a founding member of the Academy of Administrators in Academic Emergency Medicine and has served on a number of positions on the executive board, including as president during the formative years of the Academy. Jim has chaired the AAA benchmark committee since its inception and works with that team to produce benchmarks for academic emergency departments on an annual basis. So a few years ago, Jim began talking about succession planning and speaking of finding someone to succeed him in the role of chair of the benchmark committee. I was flattered when Jim approached me regarding this opportunity, and we have co-chaired the committee this past year. My hope is that the co-chair will last for quite a few more years, as Jim has done a great job chairing the committee. So I'm going to share my screen here, hopefully. So when Jim asked me to, am I sharing my screen, by the way? Okay, wasn't sure. When Jim asked me to co-chair this committee, I kind of felt like this picture's here on the screen. So for those of you who may not be big Ohio State fans,
Greg, you have to share your screen.
I thought it was, sorry. How about now?
That's good.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, for those of you who aren't big Ohio State fans or football fans, you may not be aware who these gentlemen are, but if you're not, I'll let you know who they are. So the person on the left is Woody Hayes, and the person on the right is Earl Bruce. So Woody Hayes was head coach at Ohio State from 1951 to 1978. The team won 5 national championships under his leadership and 13 Big Ten conference titles. Earl Bruce is on the right, and he had the dubious honor of succeeding the legendary Woody Hayes here at Ohio State. He coached from 1979 to 87. Teams won 2 outright Big Ten titles and 2 shared Big Ten titles. So he did a great job, but he had to follow the legend. And that is how I feel following Jim on the benchmark committee. So in addition to what I previously said about Jim, he also received in 2019 the AAAM Lifetime Achievement Award. He's always open to sharing his knowledge with our peers, which is exhibited by having 30 peer-reviewed publications. And he's a nationally and internationally known, recognized leader in emergency medicine administration. So going back to Woody Hayes, being a legend here at Ohio State, it's evident still to this day when you come on campus. The football complex is located in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. Woody Hayes Drive is directly north of Ohio Stadium, and there's even a statue of Woody Hayes on campus. So Jim, don't get your hopes up. AAAM doesn't have any buildings. We don't have any streets to name after you. We can't afford a statue. However, it is my honor on behalf of the AAAM Executive Committee, AAAM Nominating Committee, and all the AAAM members to announce that the AAAM Lifetime Achievement Award is being renamed the AAAM James J. Scheulen Lifetime Achievement Award. So with that, Jim, I'll throw it to you.
You're killing me. That's unbelievable. Oh my gosh. What can I say? That's unbelievable. I need a minute.
We thought you would. Take all the time you need.
Wow. Thank you all so very much. That's beyond words. Thank you. Okay, I think I better get into the get into the presentation. Greg and everyone, I can't tell you what this means to me. Thank you very much. Thank you. Megan, can I share my screen? Wow. Still not able to, Megan. I'm sort of
For the
usually,
share screen on the bottom, you should be able to share.
yeah, no, it's telling me, there we go. Now I got it. There we go. Okay, are you seeing this now? Okay. Yeah, I'm not usually at a loss for words, but this one got me. Thank you all very much. Well, speaking at a loss for words, there's probably really no way to talk about what the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic has been. But what I can talk about is the impact that it's had on emergency medicine, at least in the data that we're going to look at this year. Clearly, we need to think about this fiscal year 2020 as a transition year. And the reason I say that is that for about 8.5 months of the year, we were looking pretty normal. It was a normal year. And then from about mid-March through June, there was a very clear impact on our operations and our volumes. And so for 3.5 months, our data is affected by the impact of COVID. And I say it's a transition year again, because first of all, it's a mixed year there. And secondly, because in our current fiscal year, when we look at this year's data at next year's meeting, we'll see a full 12 months of the real impact of COVID on our operations. So we purposely didn't make too many changes in the survey this year because of everything that was going on. But we did, in fact, send out a special COVID survey. And some of you have heard the results of that, and you'll see some of that in the presentation today, where we got information, very specific information from about 40 of our institutions. And then we actually did a follow-up survey of that same group at the request of some of the chairs group to get even more recent data. And that's been very helpful. And you'll see some of that information today. We had a few questions about COVID that we asked in the benchmark survey, and Steve Maxwell did a great job continuing to develop the research section. As usual, all of the data in all of the formats that you all like to see is all available on the data portal, and the address is there. And of course, you'll have access to these slides. The salary survey data is still being finalized into the tables, so that might be a week or two before that's up on the site. As always, this does not happen without the support of the benchmark committee. This group of people just meets regularly, talks regularly, and is absolutely the group that's responsible for the quality of work that you see every year. I am absolutely thrilled, given everything that was going on, that we got the response we did from this year's survey. Look, I'd love to get back to the years of seeing 99, and I'd love next year for us to set a target to get 100 responses, to cross that line for the first time. But the fact that we have 90 responses, similar to the last couple of years, I was very heartened by that. And I think that's a great testament to everybody. So if you start to look at what the impact of COVID might be, by the way, the distribution of surveys from around the country is about the same as it's always been. But take a look at this. In these 90 emergency departments, similar to the year before, this 90 ED group saw almost 700,000 fewer patient visits this year than it did last year. And you'll see, and I'll say again, we were actually on a path to see a 5 or 6% patient increase across the country. So for us to have a reduction of 700,000 patient visits, a reduction, although lower volume in admissions, and a real hit to revenue, the impact of the last 3.5 months has been significant. Every year I present what is sort of the quote typical academic emergency department. This is last year's data. And when you compare it to this year's data, the first thing that jumps out is the 8% reduction in overall volume, from about 64,000 to just over 59,000. And you'll also notice that there's not much of a difference between the number of admissions or hospital observations. Those numbers are remarkably similar. The difference is in the number of patients that we treated and released. And you'll hear that theme over and over again. The overall number of EMS arrivals went down, although the percentage remained about the same. And if you operated a dedicated pediatric emergency department, you took a significant hit in your volume. And in fact, during the peak of the COVID pandemic, pediatric emergency departments, considering the reduced overall volume and the lack of flu and RSV, they frequently were down almost 70% in volume. So using some of the information we got from the COVID survey, we found that we were actually on a track. This is last year's data. We were actually on a track to have a volume increase of somewhere between 5 and 6%. But instead of our volumes increasing to about 67,000 patients per ED, it fell to 59,004. Again, largely driven by the decrease in the discharge patient population, almost no change in hospitalizations. So what does that mean for this year? If we again, using data from the supplemental survey, it looks like there's been some recovery for this current fiscal year, but not back to previous levels. And you'll actually notice that over the last 5 years or so, we've been on a downward slide. That was going to be reversed a bit this year, but that downward slide continues. So we'll see this lower volume, I think, for at least another year and maybe more. This is a slide that I used in the presentation that I talked about with the COVID data. Many of you have seen this, but for those of you who haven't, I'll quickly review. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing a normal year. In fact, we were seeing about a 5% increase. In about March, we started to see it change and we hit the low point in April. And that low point showed a volume reduction of 46% from pre-COVID to the COVID peak. We recovered to about 82% of pre-COVID volumes in July overall. The patients who were discharged, though, saw a volume reduction of 50% and only recovered in July to about 79% of pre-COVID volumes. Hospitalizations, on the other hand, fell only 30% at its peak and have recovered to 93% of pre-COVID volume as of July 2021. The pattern was identical no matter where in the country you were. The timing might have been a little bit different, but the pattern was absolutely identical. There's been conversation about the fact that we're taking care of a, quote, sicker patient population. And, you know, if you look at the ratio of ESI level 1 and 2 patients to ESI 4 and 5s, yeah, you're seeing a higher percentage of level 1 and 2 over the baseline. But remember, our overall volumes are down significantly. So we're not actually seeing a higher number of level 1 and 2 patients. It's just a higher ratio of level 1 and 2 patients. So we're actually seeing a reduction in 4s and 5s more than we're seeing an increase in 1s and 2s. But there's no question, in your ED right now, you would see a higher percentage of level 1 and 2 patients. So what happened after July? That was a question that was raised by the chairs group when I talked with them about the COVID data. So we went back to the group of 40 academic institutions that responded to the COVID survey and asked them for data from the rest of the year and into this year up until February. 20 or 22 of those places responded, and you can see what's happened since July. Not much. We haven't increased. When you control for numbers of patients per day, control for the patient number of days in a month, you can see that pre-COVID, we were seeing 211 patients per day. That fell to 117. It came back to 172, but it's faded a little bit. So now we're really only seeing about 78, maybe 80% of our pre-COVID volume as of last month. So overall, for the COVID year of February through February, we saw 58,754 patients in our emergency departments. If you look at hospitalizations, you see that once we recovered to 93% of our pre-COVID volume in July, we've actually maintained that up through February. And hospitalizations, again, we recovered to only about 78%. Discharge patients, we've recovered to only about 78% of pre-COVID volume and have actually faded now to about 72% of pre-COVID volume. So the lower acuity patient population really doesn't appear to be banging down our doors. I think it's ironic that we've seen unbelievable changes to our operations. We've seen, well, enough said. We all know that our operations have been disrupted. But interestingly enough, it's been disrupted because we've had to deal with so many patients under investigation. Because when all is said and done, I thought this was fascinating, that from the time period between March, when we started really seeing patients, in July, overall, only 3.5% of all of the ED visits during that time were for COVID positive patients. And at the peak, that was 7.2% of all ED visits. Now, yeah, the PUI volumes were significantly higher, but I just think it's interesting that that all of this effort, all of this disruption has been to the cost of 3.5% overall visits. So now back to our regularly scheduled program. This is data we look at all of the time. One of the throughput metrics we like to look at is median length of stay. And unfortunately, we continue to see an increase in length of stay, but not so much because of the discharge patient, because of the admitted patient population. Well, if we look at the bed to decision time, which I think is the critical metric for us to continue to look at, we haven't seen much change in the bed to decision time for either discharge patients or admitted patients. So if overall length of stay for admitted patients is going up, that only means one thing, right? It means that boarding time must be changing. And as much as I hate to blame everything on boarding time, Dr. Kellen knows that, but look, here's the facts. Interestingly enough, if you look at the median boarding time, it hasn't changed much. But if you look at the mean over the last 5 years, it's gone up an hour. And that's meaningful. That means that right-hand tail of the distribution of boarding hours has grown significantly. And this has happened despite the fact that during the pandemic, we found a cure for boarding. Boarding hours in April were 66% below where they'd ever been before. And even as of July, they were still down by 33%. So they've clearly crept down, and here's why. I'm sorry, they've clearly crept back up, and here's why. Look at this. From about, 6-7 years ago, when 72% of the patients were out of the ED in less than 4 hours, we're now down to about 62% of the patients out in less than 4 hours. And that has shifted all the way to the patient population who's in the ED greater than 8. Look at that increase. So that right-hand tail of this distribution just continues to grow year after year. And that's causing us incredible disruption. It is interesting to know that the number of places, or the percentage of places that seem to have inpatient teams care for patients in the emergency department who are boarding, seems to have increased significantly from a couple of years ago. So now this year, 2/3 of the places who report having inpatient teams take care of non-ICU patients. A smaller number, and this hasn't changed for the last couple of years, a smaller number of hospitals provide some additional nursing support, and some give financial recognition for the fact that you're holding patients in your beds. Hadn't been a lot of change in resource utilization, maybe a little uptick in CT utilization over the years. And one of the things I think that people feel is when we look at MRI turnaround time, we report the median is about 4 hours. But when you look at the mean, it's really 7 hours. And I think that's what people feel. So getting an MRI is not an insignificant contributor to extending your length of stay. I wish we had lots and lots of time to talk about complexity. This is an interesting year to talk about complexity because of the disruption of the patient volumes and patient types. We've actually seen, instead of all 5 of our metrics as normal going up, we have actually seen a couple of our metrics go up slightly. Hospitalization rate, high acuity pro fee codes, acuity 1 and 2 percentages, but EMS and EMS admissions have not increased as previous years. So the bottom line is, when we look at the complexity index that we continue to work on, the complexity index overall from year to year has not changed much. You can look on the website and you'll see where your ranking is and how that's changed. But the academic institutions continue to see a more complex population by our own definition than the other types of emergency departments, and that hasn't changed. The case mix intensity of patients that we've admitted to the hospital through our emergency department has also not changed from last year to this. If we look at our academic institutions compared to the other types of emergency departments, again, not too much has changed. We continue to be the biggest of the departments. We continue to admit the most patients. We continue to have the highest case mix intensity of the admitted patients. And probably, therefore, we tend not to put as many patients through our beds as the others. So we're, quote, not as efficient as the other types of emergency departments. This is a new thing. I kind of have this, I had this thought that I hate looking at total length of stay because I know that's what the patient feels, and I think it's a valuable metric to keep an eye on, but it really doesn't tell us what the value added time is. In my mind, the time that matters and the time we control is the bed to decision time for both discharged and admitted patients. So I decided to take a look at, well, what percentage of the total length of stay is actually value added time for the patient? And this was, look, a fairly superficial look, so I'm more than happy to work with somebody to dig a little bit more deeply. But the bottom line is, if you're a patient who comes to the emergency department and you end up being discharged, about 73% of the time that you are in the system, about 73% of your length of stay, is dedicated to either treating you or making a decision about what needs to happen to you. But if you're an admitted patient, only about 45% of your time is worth anything. The rest of it, you're waiting for something. You're waiting to be seen. You're waiting for a bed. You're waiting for something. And that to me is not value added time. So just another twist on sort of how patients spend their time in our emergency departments. So our throughput times, again, haven't changed significantly, and our academic institutions have longer throughput times for total length of stay, longer throughput times for bed to decision time, which again hasn't changed. Probably a bit of a teaching impact, probably a bit of the fact that we do see patients that are more complex than the other institutions. There's been no change in the nursing hours of care per day in any of our treatment areas. There's been no change in the patient to nurse ratios in any of our treatment areas. There's been no change in the fact that for the most part, 96% of all of the budgeted nursing hours are in fact worked. So it's not like there are lots and lots of open nursing positions, but we did see a significant change in the nursing support hours. So for whatever reason, purposeful or not, the nursing support staff did not work the same number of budgeted hours as they have in previous years. Not much change to talk about in terms of our residency programs, although it looks like there was maybe a shift a little bit, or a couple of more places perhaps reporting 4-year programs and not 3. All right, let's shift gears now and talk about faculty and faculty life. I know I need to speed things up here. Faculty hours, a little bit less maybe than previous years, and I'm not sure if that's a COVID impact. We'll see what next year brings, but I can tell you that on a per hour, arrivals per hour basis, this is exactly the same as it was last year and the year before. So we're not necessarily seeing fewer hours per patient arrival. I will continue to argue that physician staffing, and I would argue nurse staffing, but physician staffing is not a linear relationship with total arrivals. About 50% of the variability of the staffing is described by the regression. I think that there is a semi-variable component to physician staffing, and this is a great, I think, depiction of 10,000 patient increments, where if you look at the group roughly from 40 to 50,000, nobody staffs less than about 17,000 hours. Nobody staffs less than 20,000 hours for a 60,000 visit ED. Nobody staffs less than 22,000 hours for a 70,000 ED, and so forth. So I think that we need to continue to talk with our leadership about semi-variable staffing and not linear. I also thought it was interesting to take a look this year, not just at who covers our main ED, who provides most of the care, but to look at who provides care throughout the emergency department. And this conversation came up in part because we're beginning to hear, and I don't know if this is your experience, but we hear, and then in the benchmark group, there was discussion about the fact that finding and keeping APPs is getting to be more and more of a challenge. What's interesting is if you look at who provides hours of care in the main ED, residents provide a bulk of the care in the main ED, supported by about 24 hours a day of APP coverage and attending coverage. So that's the total hours of the main ED distributed by who provides the care. Now, if you add, well, who provides care in all areas of the ED, it's interesting to notice that the resident hours don't change. So if you operate screening, fast track, observation, whatever other kind of portion of your ED you might operate, those hours are covered largely by APPs, with some increase as well in attending hours. So the care and feeding of APPs is important, perhaps not as much to the operation of the quote main ED, but certainly for the operation of other parts of the emergency department. As far as the salary survey is concerned, we got a great response. Good number of faculty comparable to previous years. Not much change in terms of the overall demographics. A little bit of an uptick now, continued uptick in the graduates being out 10 to 14 years. That's sort of what we've been expecting to see over the last couple of years, and we're seeing it now. Concomitant with that, we see a little bit of a rise in the associate professor level rank, and that makes sense. As the population gets a little bit older, their rank, you would expect their rank to go up. In terms of gender, we continue to see about 61% male, 39% female. What's kind of interesting, and we need to keep an eye on this, is that for the last 5, 6, 7 years, we were beginning to see, if you look at this grid down here, sort of a 55-45 split of male to female. But this year, the new entries into our faculty are 64% male, 36% female. So we'll see if this is a blip or if this trend continues next year. We also continue to be largely white, with about 5% of our faculty being African American. As far as salary is concerned, we know that all of these things impact faculty salary. They are all interrelated one way or another. I'll comment a bit about all of those. Overall this year, if you include everybody, chairs, chiefs, and everybody else, we saw about a 3.5% salary increase. Interesting, because for the previous 3 years, there hadn't been much of an increase at all. A 3.5% increase in total salary and a 3% increase in base, so that now, as in previous years, about 84% of total salary is in base salary. If we take out chairs and chiefs, we see a similar increase in overall rise in salary, a similar increase in base, so that again, 84% of total salaries tends to be in base salary, supplemented by one of 2 or 3 other ways to supplement salary. First year salaries, though, have gone up more substantially, about a 6% increase from last year. But again, you'll notice that the previous 3 years have been relatively flat in terms of salary. And so a bit of an increase for first year salary in this year's survey. Salary, of course, is impacted by the number of years as faculty and the rank. And as you would expect from year to year, we've seen an increase in every rank. Interesting layout by region. We haven't really looked at it this way in the past, but this is the pattern that we've seen in the Northeast in terms of salary. Some increase from 16 to 18, flattening out last year, a little bit of a rise this year, and that's mirrored by the salaries from the South. The Midwest has been a little bit different, with a bit of an increase in 17, flatten out to 18, and then a little bit of a bump in 19, which was continued into 20. The West, which was always on the lower end, but fairly close, all of us were fairly close through 18. The West then saw a substantial increase last year, and that increase continued this year, so that the increases that we saw overall were largely driven by about a 6% increase in the Northeast and South, and about a 9.5% increase in those institutions in the West. There continues to be a very strong linear relationship between clinical hours worked and salary, but when you add administrative duties, you see a significant reduction in clinical hours worked and a significant increase in salary, and that's what this mass of dots are over here. Interestingly enough, the practice setting matters a little bit less now than it has. In fact, in this year, in our own community hospitals, the academic faculty make as much, maybe even a little bit more, than those who work in our community institutions. As far as gender is concerned, again, I'm sure this is one of those things we can look at in a number of ways. But this year, for the first time, when you look at the instructor, male, female, there is no difference in salary there. There's about a 5 or 6% increase as you move through assistant and associate professor rank, although there is some more seniority. Males are longer in rank and longer in service at both the associate and professor level. And if you look at the clinical hours worked, although the men are paid at a 5 or 6% sort of premium, they also work 4% more hours. And so I think what we might be seeing, maybe, is the beginning of the closing of the gap that we identified in salary between gender. Before we get into compensation plans, we did ask a few questions about the impact of the pandemic on compensation. And it's kind of interesting, actually. One of the questions we asked was, did your faculty see any compensation reduction as a result of the pandemic? And 38% of faculty did see overall compensation reduced one way or another. But interestingly enough, in exactly the opposite direction, almost the same percentage saw extra salary or extra incentive pay as a result of the pandemic. The other sort of interesting thing is that about 22% of faculty saw some reduction in retirement contributions. Not a lot of change in terms of the components of compensation plans, although I will say there's been a significant reduction away from the more complex 4-component plan. Most of our faculty are covered by a 3-component compensation plan, which means a base salary and then either or 2 of the 3, extra hour pay, a stipend, or a bonus. 2 of those 3 things supplement the base salary. And then, of course, there's a variety of benefit packages that go along with compensation. I want to bring this up every year. I know I'm going quickly, but I want to try to get through the information as much as possible. I bring this up every year, and again, I don't know if this concerns everybody else or if I should just stop looking at it, but I can tell you that this number in between 2015 and now has grown from 63% effort towards clinical work to now 69%, with a reduction in effort dedicated to research, education, and administration. I just think we need to be aware of that, particularly in our academic institutions. Rank and clinical hours continue to be related, as you would expect. The higher the rank, the fewer clinical hours. Academics, those working in academic institutions work fewer clinical hours than those working in other settings. As far as money is concerned, yeah, we've seen a significant hit overall to revenue, but on a per visit basis, our collections this year are actually pretty good. It's just that our overall patient visit volume is down, and so that's affected our overall collections. But take a look at this shift in E&M codes. We'll see if this is a COVID impact. We'll see how this plays out over the next months to years. But take a look at this reduction in level 3 E&M codes and this significant increase over the years in level 5 and critical care. So clearly, we're seeing a very significant increase in the higher billing codes. Maybe representative of the patient population, maybe representative documentation, not sure, but that's what's driving our revenue. No real change in payer mix distribution to speak of. About 2 to 3 years ago, we began talking with the chairs group about the fact that we'd like to start to identify some benchmarks that we can use to benchmark our faculty. How many publications should we expect? How many RVUs should we expect? And what we've talked about at the benchmark committee so far is to try to get some objective information about RVU productivity at the faculty level, something about publications at the faculty level, and then something about grant work at the faculty level. Last year, we started collecting this. This year, we started collecting this. We hope next year we'll start to collect this. So in terms of RVUs per faculty, overall, if you're getting 5.6 RVUs per faculty member, that's about where you should be on a blended basis. But by rank, you can see that the associate professors are sort of the most efficient. Unfortunately, they don't work the most hours, but they produce the highest work RVUs per clinical hour. So this is at least a start at a benchmark that you can use for RVU productivity. And for publications, I think we need to go back and sharpen our pencils and make sure we're asking the right question the right way. But the first look at this would suggest that at the mean, and there was quite a range of publications, as you can see, at the mean, instructors would publish about 2, assistant professors might publish 3. And again, there's lots of co-authorship. This wasn't necessarily first authors. So we need to talk a little bit about what we're collecting. And so it might make sense to focus more on the median number here. And they're fairly modest numbers, but again, at least the first step at looking at publications. But this clearly needs to be looked at again. Now, this is a natural transition point for me to stop talking and to turn you over to Steve Maxwell, who is our resident expert at the research and our research benchmarking. And so, Steve, I'll be happy to drive for you, but
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. I sort of feel like Earl Bruce on September 8th as he took the field in the horseshoe to face Syracuse, which I believe they ended up winning all of their regular season games that year. So hopefully we can do justice to these next few slides as well. In terms of the number of sites that report research activity, it's about half of those that complete the overall survey. And we saw a similar dip from 2017 to 2018 to 2019, with then the number of sites reporting information coming back up this year to 48 showing active grants and 41 showing NIH grants. Next slide, please. And so as we look at the number of grants submitted, you can see a large increase here. And we'll talk a little bit about what made up that increase. When you look at the conversion rates, only a subset of those sites that completed the research section completed the conversion rate section. So the awarded from submissions is actually a calculation based on a subset of the 1,158, just over 800. So that's why the math doesn't add up on that. But for those sites that submitted conversion rates, it was 44%, which was 356 of the 800. Next slide, please. And so here you can start to see the table of the different types of grants over the last few years and how they're trending. It's important to note a couple things. In the bottom right-hand corner, as you look at that 410 NIH grants, that's about 12% higher than the prior years, which is consistent with the 12% overall. The funding rate is a little bit higher, and we're investigating a couple of sites that reported numbers that seem to be outliers, and just want to verify that the way that those numbers was reported was proper. But I think it's, there's just some great news here. I think particularly as you see the impact of COVID and you look in the industry line, you'll notice that the number of grants increased about 17%, and the dollar value about 30%. So I think we're seeing that as well. Next slide, please, Jim. And so here you start to see a trend just looking at the different sites and their grant funding. So there's, probably 8 sites that have higher funding, and then there's kind of some quartiles below that that have other sites. So this is the distribution of the sites and how much funding they have. But overall, we're looking at an increase in the number of sites, the number of grants, and the dollar value per grant. Next slide, please. So here what we started to do was try and draw some correlations between the total amount of grant spending on your x-axis and then the amount of grants that were submitted. And what you can kind of see here is that there's a good correlation between the size of your existing research portfolio as measured by grant spending and the number of grants that were submitted this cycle. Next slide, please, Jim. And so here we're starting to try and correlate the success rate of grant submissions versus total spending. And what we've actually found is that it's about 40%. That's the median. That was close to the average. And so what we really feel is that the size of your research infrastructure does not dictate the success of your rate in terms of receiving grants. We looked at this by rank as well, and there was a similar correlation for junior investigators as well as senior investigators, and it seems to be around 40%. Next slide, Jim. So then we looked at grant success rate relative to grants submitted. And again, it seems to be pretty consistent at that 40% rate. So it doesn't seem like as you submit more that your success rate goes up or goes down. Next slide, please, Jim. So then we were trying to look and see if it related to the number of faculty in terms of the number of grants that you had. And so we measured faculty based on faculty with at least 10% effort funded on external grants. And what we really found is that there was not a increased number of faculty relative to the number of grants. So the faculty that were doing the grants at the institutions that had more funding were just on more grants at a higher percentage, but not necessarily more faculty. Next slide, Jim. So then we started to look at, was there a correlation between MD PhDs or PhDs within the department and the number of active grants? And it does seem that there is a correlation in that those institutions that have more grants are investing in PhDs. And that there is a higher number of MD PhDs in those institutions that have more grants. Next slide, Jim. And we also looked at the peer-reviewed publications, and there's a nice correlation between the amount of research spending and peer-reviewed publications. Next slide, Jim. And so we wanted to look at the pipeline of our junior investigators. And so there were 34 sites that reported that they had there were 34 K awardees across 16 sites. Of those 16 sites, 10 reported submitting Ks this cycle, and there were an additional 7 institutions that submitted K awards this cycle that do not have a K award. So what we're starting to see is a building of the junior investigators through the K awards for a future pipeline of investigators in the specialty. Next slide, please. So there are some limitations to this, and it's important to understand that what we're reporting is the data that was reported to us. So it's a subset of the departments, so we don't know for those departments that didn't submit what they had. There are publicly available sources, and so we've attempted to correlate to those. We think we're capturing a high percentage of those, and it does seem like our data is consistent with what you see from NIH Reporter and from Blue Ridge. There is some variability in the number of sites that report year over year and in the way that our sites report. And so we're working with the sites to try and standardize the way that we answer the questions. So we're answering questions in the same way. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? That there is a correlation between grant submission funding, that success rate is not linked to the size of the research enterprise, that the number of publications and research funding, that there's a correlation there as well, and with the amount of overall research funding, not necessarily the number of investigators. Next slide, please. And so the good news in all of this is that as a specialty, the number of institutions reporting activity continues to grow over the last few years, both in number of grants and in the amount of funding. The number of grants submitted is growing above the rate of the growth rate that we've seen in active grants and in spending. So that would indicate, assuming that our success rate is consistent over time, that the active grants and spending in future years should grow. And the number of K awardees, or those faculty that are pursuing research, is increasing as well. Next slide, and thank you.
Steve, that is unbelievably strong. Thank you very much. That is wonderful. So, yep, it's been sort of another interesting year. We managed to get that information to you, by the way, in 39 minutes and 21 seconds. So I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions. I want to thank you all so very much for being here, and I really wish we could talk forever, but.
Thank you both for a really outstanding presentation, as always. It's always so informative and just packed with information. So let's even though we're running, I know we have a break coming up, but can we just do at least a little bit of questions? Would be really good. Let's take some questions.
Peter, this is Nate. Can I have just a quick question?
Sure, Nate.
Yeah, great. Hey, thanks, Jim. As always, just outstanding. Really appreciate the data. I had just a question on the last comment about, the size of the research enterprise not correlated with grant funding, and I'm just having a little bit difficult putting my head around it, because of course, without a research manager, without research coordinators, it's hard for me to imagine that you have the same grant success as if you have people participating and assisting with those submissions, et cetera. So I just am kind of curious about the definition of the size of the research enterprise. What exactly does that mean?
So specifically, we were looking at the size of the enterprise as in active grants spend and number of active grants. So the percentage of grants that an institution submits and then receives seems to be relatively constant as the number of grants or the grant spending at that institution increases. So an institution that spends $1 million a year has roughly the same success rate as one that spends $16 million a year.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks. Because I was interpreting this as sort of, when I think of our research enterprise, I think about the numbers and the type of people we have to kind of facilitate grant submissions and whatnot as a key part of our enterprise.
And we attempted to try and capture some data around that by asking the department investment in research spend, but the way that departments defined that was so variable that it was difficult to draw a conclusion from it. But we'll try and tighten that up, because that's a great question, Nate. I totally agree with you.
Thanks much, Steve. Really appreciate the work.
Other questions or thoughts?
I saw a question in the chat from Brendan asking what's the definition of grants for this series of slides that Steve was presenting?
So it's external funding, and we put in the different types. I don't know, Jim, if you want to share the slide, that's the table that has like the 10 different types. So we broke out NIH into 5 or 6 different categories, and then we had like CDC, AHRQ, and we asked, if you have a grant. And so the active grant and spend, this is a great question. So if you look at our total number of R awards that are reporting, it's more than the number of R awards within the specialty. And what we think by that is that people with co-Is that are spending at multiple institutions, that single grant is getting captured in several places, but the spend at the grant is the spend that you're spending within your institution. And so it does correlate to the spending within the individual institutions.
Maybe one more question if we have one, and if not, we'll take our break.
This is Gail. I'm sorry, I can't seem to get my hand up on the regular screen, but part of the disconnect is that you're measuring grant success in the same year as grant submitted. And so there's a huge disconnect with that, because you're not going to get the NIH grants until the following year or resubmission. So I think there's kind of a weirdness when you always ask that. as amount is submitted. You may submit a lot one year and not get them till the next year. And the next year, if you get them, you don't submit that many. So it's a real disconnect. Really what we should be saying is, of those grants that you submit a year later, how many of those did you receive?
And we continue to try and tweak the definition on that to get it as accurate as possible. I agree with you. It's very difficult. And it's also difficult to standardize across, our 100 institutions.
Yeah, I just don't want people to think that they spend money they're not going to do well, because that's not the success of the top of us who have lots of grants. If you put more in investment in, you do with faculty development, with whatever it is that you need, you do better.
Well, what I think though is that actually there is success even if you're only submitting at the success. The more you submit, the more you get, but the percentage doesn't actually change. So the encouragement, I think, would be to say we should continue to develop people that are submitting grants and encourage those submissions, because that does seem to indicate that you grow the overall population of investigators and spend.
David Wright put a chat in that asked about the number. Could we look at the number of coordinators and research staff? We actually did that in previous years. We can certainly put that back on. We didn't find there was a particularly tight connection in the past, but maybe things have matured to the point where that's another way we can look at the research infrastructure and whether that's related to success. So we can take that under advisement. Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, everybody, thank you so much. Steve, again, you have done a magnificent job with the research section, and I don't know how to tell you all finally just how much the honor that you talked about in my introduction means to me. And I look forward to seeing you all next year. And the benchmark committee starts its work next month. So let's go. Start.
Excellent.
I want to cross that 100 mark, everybody. Please drive us to that finish line.
Thank you both again for an outstanding presentation. We have a few minutes to check email, take breaks. We're the staff will magically transport you to the breakout rooms for our individual sessions again. And I know for the chairs, we'll be talking about building a research pipeline. So it's perfect transition for us as well. So, all right, we'll see everyone at the top of the hour. Thank you.